Thank you everybody for attending this session. My name is Jay Calloway. I'm one of the sales guys for GuidePoint Security, in Raleigh, local to the area. Wanted to introduce you to Tony Cook and Drew Schmitt. They're on our GFI team. There we go. One of these. You guys can change it. So today they're going to talk about ransomware's current state of affairs. You can take your questions.
I will be taking questions.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Hammer him with as many questions as you have. I'm sure he wants to keep it engaging as possible. And if you have any questions, we're upstairs. Right as soon as you get past the escalator, turn right. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, sure.
Alright, so as Jay said, my name is Tony Cook. I have Drew Schmitt with me. Just a little bit of background about me. My main background is DoD. So I came over to GuidePoint after running the DHA, Defense Health Agency. Saw it for a while, but I used to run the malware analysis with your friends.
My name is Drew Schmitt. I'm the lead analyst over on the GuidePoint Research and Intelligence team, which we call GRIT. Not from the DoD. Mostly just spend my time in consulting and corporate environments. I really focus on malware research and focusing on ransomware and e-crime specifically. And I've spent time in IT, saw kind of all spaces of cybersecurity before I went into
More importantly, we're not the sales guys here, so you don't have to worry about that part. We won't be pitching anything today.
Go here.
Yeah, so as far as what we're going to get into today, we want to focus a lot on ransomware. Primarily because we spend a lot of time researching this area, but also we just want to focus on why this is a consistently growing threat for pretty much all industry verticals. Really want to take a look at some of the contributing factors as to why that's the case. And then we want to break down with some statistics in terms of what the trends are and how these statistics really give the insight into what ransomware's current state of affairs is. And lastly, we're going to get into kind of a ransomware threat actor breakdown, give you some insight into the kind of top 3 threat actors that we're seeing so far in 2022 from a couple of different perspectives before kind of giving some upsides to the doom and gloom that we're seeing on a pretty consistent basis.
So ransomware is here, right? I don't think ransomware is ever really going to go away. I think we're all kind of been hit with this hammer enough times to be numb to it, right? You hear the word ransomware, and either you're CISO and you're getting a little bit worried about it, or you're an analyst and like, I've heard this word so many times, it really doesn't matter anymore. But it still is a thing, right? While they are evolving, and while we're still seeing some things kind of come out, we'll talk about it a little bit later through this, whether they're not even performing the ransomware event itself, and maybe they're just doing the extortion portion of it, it's still, at the end of the day, trying to get money out of you. So some of the big things that we see out of this are critical vulnerabilities being weaponized much faster than they used to be, right? Like we go from things like Log4j or Spring4j, like within a couple of days, these things are being turned around from like POCs to being used and active in campaigns against people. So some of the other stuff that we'll be talking about is like how they're avoiding being kind of caught, whether that's changing infrastructure or changing names to make sure that they're kind of blending across this concept of rebranding everything as they go. And then as we continue to go through all these, we see new ways that they're trying to get things out of you, right? Whether that's, we had an encryption event and we're not going to pay, so now we're going to try to DDoS, maybe some of your cloud-based things. They're going to continue to try to find new ways to get you to pay. And so what are they actually trying to look at for these particular portions, right? Like who are they targeting? Obviously, the same thing as they have been in the past, and coming into 2022, they're still searching where they're going to get their money out of, right? Large organizations, financial organizations, even if I get a small part of your infrastructure, you're probably going to have to pay me, right? Before I can get some kind of decent information out of you, whether that's HIPAA video, or it's PII, or that's some sort of financial information, you're probably going to end up paying. Critical infrastructure, we've seen them kind of like turn away from critical infrastructure, but only certain groups. Some groups are still actively targeting nothing but critical infrastructure because they know that some local government's going to pay or some insurance is going to pay out for them.
And so one of the biggest things that's actually contributed to the growth of ransomware has been the ransomware as a service model, also known as the affiliate program model. And so basically what this is, it allows for a core group of developers to develop ransomware and ransomware tools and then other individuals can be vetted to be able to use that ransomware throughout their operations. And so then, in that case, the ransomware core group is going to take a cut of that from their affiliates, and then the affiliates get to take the rest. For instance, with Lockbit, which is the screenshot you see here on the upper right, they're going to take a 20% cut, flat rate for all the victims that are hit by their affiliates. Some of the others, whether it's Alpha or Conti, are going to be a little bit different. At least Conti when they were still operating. But really what this has led to is a whole bunch of different individuals that act as affiliates to be able to be affiliated with multiple ransomware groups. So the same affiliate can actually do operations for Lockbit, they can do operations for Alpha, they can do operations for Black Matter, and be able to expand their capabilities and also make themselves hit a little bit more.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's right.
Exactly. And also what we need to do is more of like a competition for different ransomware groups. So we have groups like Lockbit that battle back and forth with Black Hat or also Alpha or Conti or other groups. And so when we look at things like the dark web, you actually see a lot of these groups arguing with one another, which is great for us because then they typically drop some sort of information that violates good OPSEC, which is great for us. But also just kind of shows you that there are a lot of competitions that ultimately lead to more ransomware being developed and implemented within the criminal underground.
But as we see like this ransomware as a service thing kind of break out, where we know that there are affiliates associated with this, the more and more we see this idea of criminals getting a lot better at something very specific, right? Some are really good pen testers. Some are really good at getting inside of an environment, and so that's where we'll get like the initial infection vectors. But they're just selling that, right? I got into this environment, I didn't get around real well, but I did get in, I used this vulnerability to do it. I'm going to sell this to somebody who's better at that one, and then I'm going to sell it to somebody else who's going to be able to do the affiliate model to be able to get in. So breaking this down like it is a business, right? Getting the people that are very good at things and using them to be able to get inside your environment.
Absolutely. So this is an example of what Lockbit's ransomware panel looks like. And I know it's probably a little bit small for some of you sitting in the back, but across the top here, you can see the different portions of the panel. So you can actually get some statistics on your operations. There's the builder, which you see here. This is responsible for actually developing the ransomware executable that's going to be deployed within the environment. So towards the top here, you have the company website, you have revenue, which is all going to be linked directly to the leak site used by Lockbit. Then you have kind of your whitelisting items here where you're saying, don't encrypt these files or these folders, these files, any extensions of this nature. So this is where you're customizing everything that's going to be incorporated within your ransomware executable. This just shows you kind of the flexibility and the sophistication behind a lot of what Lockbit is doing as a ransomware as a service group. This is really, really professionally developed in terms of what we're talking about from a capabilities perspective, as well as just a look and feel. This is something that you would see, pretty much on something, or you would see something similar on pretty much any e-commerce site. So they have access to all the publications, the blog, there's an FAQ, there's some news, there's all kinds of features built into what Lockbit is doing from a ransomware as a service perspective, which is pretty common amongst the larger groups.
And you'll see those tabs across the top as well. So they have Steelers, red, black, or even Linux or EXI, however they want to attack them.
Yep. All kinds of features. It's actually pretty crazy. Let me break it down a little bit. So Tony had mentioned this rebranding process. And so this is something that we've hypothesized for a while now, that it was going to become more and more used by ransomware groups. And I think this kind of showcases it on the right-hand side here, that shows some of the major rebrands that we've tracked and the industry has seen over the last couple of years. And so the main purpose, really, as Tony mentioned before, is obfuscation. They're taking their main group, they're taking their TTPs, they're changing them slightly, they're calling themselves a new name, they have a new leak site. And so it just makes it a little bit harder to stay on top of tracking these individuals and these groups for the operations that they're doing. So really the main purpose here is to hide, and especially when we're talking about all of these groups here, which are all associated with Evil Corp. Evil Corp is on the US Treasury sanctions list, so you can't actually pay them. If you are hit by any of these ransomware groups, you're not actually allowed to pay them without incurring fines from the U.S. Treasury. Other major rebrands that we've seen, Ryuk, which was huge in 2017, 2018, 2019 timeframe. They moved to Conti, which through the end of 2020 into 2021 was a huge group, and they just recently kind of quote unquote disbanded in favor of what appears to be more of a rebrand or a kind of spreading out into these groups up here, which include Black Masta, Alpha, Hive, Parakurz, Ageless Locker, Hello Kitty. And so that just shows you where if you take a core group and you split them up into 6, 7 different groups, that's going to make it a little bit harder to actually track them long term. And then if some of those groups go away and spread out and rebrand themselves, it just becomes even more and more muddy waters when we're talking about tracking and associating activity that's intra-there that's coming from these groups.
And we'll still see some overlap, right? Sometimes they'll use the same infrastructure. A lot of times they'll try to use new stuff. They'll have to go back to some IP address that they've used in the past. But we'll also see things where like the crypto wallets that they're using are being reused over and over again. Or at some point you can track back to it. Like Conti at the end, I think they had, what was it, like $2.6 billion that they had amassed across all of it. So pretty successful, but then broken across all of these various different new organizations that are popping up.
Right, and that's a great point too, because when you see all of the evil core groups, the second one, who we actually work with, their Malware team quite a bit, to share intelligence, they did a really great paper on all of the code overlaps between Waze and Lockbit, Tamer, Billogen, Phoenix, all of these different versions here, and really did a code level analysis on showing how they're all linked. So even some of the best groups, state sponsored groups, are still using portions of the same code. And so through enough time, we're able to make those correlations, but it does just show you kind of how effective the rebranding process is.
Right, so another thing that we need to keep in mind while we're going through this is that these hackers are actually trying to attack each other sometimes as well. But there's also this concept of being leaked out from various different portions, right? So we saw twice, Conti get kind of all of their information get leaked for various different reasons, right? One reason was they kind of got into this conflict where Russia and Ukraine kind of came back and forth. Conti said that they were going to get behind Russia. Others said that's really not the way things should work. We work with you guys, we want you to do something different, and then spiffs kind of happened. Next thing you know, they're leaking out all this information. The first Conti leak was awesome. We were able to get through like what their TTPs were, what their playbooks were, essentially just like into the mind of what these guys were doing, and be able to get all those TTPs out. Now, obviously, they were still successful afterwards, right? I mean, these guys don't have to change up a whole lot for it to still work. Some of the things that they have they're doing. Yes, also Mabook, Ransomware, I never say that right, so just in case I did say it wrong, there it is. Some of them just releasing their entire source code, right? Like these guys just getting fed up enough with a certain developer to say, I'm done with you. Here's all their source code to be able to do with, right? So you can use that to be able to have effective mitigations against it as well. So, but with the second Conti leak, we were able to find various different things about chat logs, who they were dealing with, some of the critical infrastructure that they had underneath. So it was really, like, it's great for us to deal with those portions, but obviously on their side, probably not too happy about it.
Yeah, I think one of the other things too that's particularly interesting about source code leaks is we actually start seeing that source code end up in different ransomware groups, I guess, and a lot of that contributes to what might be misinterpreted as a rebrand when we're talking about, hey, there's this new group, they have a huge overlap with Babbitt. Well, they have their source code released, so theoretically anybody in this room or anybody anywhere could actually go find that, make some small tweaks, and now they have their own ransomware that looks like it was Babbitt, but really it's you just making some changes based on something that's already been leaked. So while it's great that things get leaked from their perspective, at least for us, so that we get insight into what's going on, what their code looks like, it also potentially introduces additional problems for us as defenders because then other people can pick that up and just kind of run with it.
So insurance, right? This is a popular thing for everybody nowadays. Should I get insurance? Should I not? How do I get insurance? Insurance is just as good for the bad guys as it is for you, right? At the end of the day, it's just a risk mitigation. It's making sure that I can have the money to be able to pay just in case I do get hit on various different points of this, or be able to get back up to a normal operating state. But what actors do are actively try to find or hit these various different insurance, and they might not even try to do much besides exfil out what that client list is, so that now I know exactly who to hit and how much they're insured for. And so now we have, in the various different leaks that we've seen in some of the Telegram groups, sharing exactly what their list of people, what their victims are going to be based off of those particular questions, right? So some of the big ones that we try to find through those are manufacturing, financial services, healthcare, the big game, I guess, at the end of the day. That's what they're trying to go after for those, because they know that they have to be assured because of various different regulations and things like that.
Yeah, I think even anecdotally, one of the things that our team does is ransomware negotiations, and there's been several instances where we've come to the table with negotiation and we say, hey, whatever your initial demand is, actually we just got one the other day that was their initial demand was $870K. We basically, that's way too high for most organizations, even with cyber insurance. A lot of times what they're going to come back with is, and this has happened to me more than once, they'll just send a document back to the chat, and that'll be the insurance policy that says they're covered for X amount of dollars. And so they basically are saying, well, we already know how much your organization can cover, so let's not play this game. And they don't factor in things like recovery costs and things like that. But that's a lot of their strategy. They're looking for insurance documents simply so that they can come back and say, no, we know you're trying to bluff us here. So. Alright, so just kind of changing gears a little bit and getting into the statistics associated with the current state of affairs and trends that we're seeing in 2022. So we recently updated this presentation with the most recent numbers through the end of August 2022. And so this is showing the trends of publicly posted ransomware victims so far in 2022. So we see like a huge, right off the bat in 2022, huge ramp up in terms of what we're seeing in terms from activity from all ransomware groups across all industries. There was kind of this little slowdown that we see here in May. And a lot of that actually was really tied to Lockbit's transition from version 2 to version 3. So they were using Lockbit 2, they've been using that for about a year or a little over a year, and they were very successful with that. But they just recently moved to Lockbit 3. During that time, which was right at the beginning of May, we did see this real kind of sharp drop in activity before it kind of leveled out and got back into the average rate of posting victims. At the same time is when Conti shut down and supposedly rebranded into a bunch of other groups as well. So that's where we see kind of that slowdown over a period of a couple months there. That was also kind of at the beginning of summer, so potentially they were taking some summer vacation themselves.
Or maybe people are getting better at it.
Or people are finally figuring this out. But the line that's kind of in the back here is the overall number of victims throughout the year. So you can actually see how it's consistently rising. And I think one of the things that this illustrates is the importance of examining ransomware at a higher level and not necessarily thinking that ransomware is going away simply because we're more focused on proxy shell and Log4j and other critical vulnerabilities. This is something that's always with us. It's consistently happening. And that's kind of the main takeaway here is that it's still a really big problem.
So this is a geographic breakdown of like where we see it. Obviously, the United States is going to be number one in this one. It's because of how easy it is for people to get in and get paid for it, right? So a bunch of businesses in the United States are going to be insured. They're going to have things ready to go for people to get hit and then paid for. What we're also seeing is while it kind of slows down this year in the United States, we're seeing it ramp up in Germany and most of Europe as they come across. The United Kingdom spiked up at the beginning of this year with just a new way. So as we're starting to either one, get better in the United States about making sure that we have defenses in place, or two, the regulations and everything else as we're seeing these groups kind of rebrand and get away from their normal tactics and get into their own ways, like we'll see a little bit, Alpha B and everything else. They're starting to take a good look at Europe and South America in particular and see what they can get out from there. Right? It's a lot easier. We've been getting pounded in the United States for a long time with ransomware, 2 or 3 years at least, with some record numbers on some of those. Now let's try to see the soft underbelly of where everyone else is.
And so from a similar perspective, this is a breakdown of all the ransomware victims by threat actor. And so off the left-hand side is Lockbit, and we basically had to take them and separate them from the rest of the groups because they're so much more active than anybody else so far in 2022. And so they're upwards of close to 600 victims at this point in 2022 at the end of August. whereas even the next closest is Alpha, and they're just under 160 victims. So just shows you how prolific Lockbit has been in 2022, and this was true even at the end of 2021. But it also just shows you the breakdown of the rest of the field there. They're all pretty active in terms of the number of victims that they're claiming publicly. And that's something to keep in mind here as well, is this is just public victims. This is a public data set, so you can go and recreate this on your own if you'd like. This doesn't account for everything that's happened that's not public. So people who have paid ransoms, people who have just not had any kind of leak happen, those are not accounted for yet. So even these numbers are huge in terms of what we're seeing in 2022, but this is definitely not all encompassing as far as all the victims that we're seeing. And so even, as more of a little bit of a case study here, the darker blue, it represents financial services. And so you can see the differences in targeting methodology by some of these groups. Some groups really don't focus on financial services at all. Some do. We see Alpha, particularly having a kind of a larger representation of financial services. And then you kind of see it an in-between where, maybe most of those groups are operating just based on a general targeting methodology that allows for financial services to be infected or encrypted every once in a
while. So again, as we saw in that last slide, it looks like a little bit of a sliver, right? That was financial services, but in this case study, that was actually like a ridiculous amount of the money that they actually made out of these, right? So while they might be a smaller in the amount of number that they have, the amount of money that they're getting from these financial services are significantly more than the rest that they're going to have. We see here down at the bottom some decent graphs. You probably can't really see too well here, but we see technology, healthcare, and financials. So we have 6.8, 6.1, and 5.5, and then 81% of everyone else getting it. But in that small amount of 6.8, 6.1, whatever that math is, right? I can't do it right now, I'm long over. But these ones we're dealing with, actually come up with 48% of how much money they actually get out of everything here. So they're definitely thinking that financial services are worth their while, and they're going to continue to go after those ones.
So now, getting into what some of these threat look like. We already talked about ransomware as a service and how that works. But what do some of these threat groups actually look like? So to start with, we mentioned Lockit already, and the fact that they are very prolific in 2022 and over the last couple of years. This is a group that's been around since 2019. They've kind of really gotten their stuff figured out from a more immature organization all the way through up until recently, where they're a very sophisticated organization. Where you saw their panel, you probably heard of their leak site. They have a whole lot of victims. We're seeing almost 600 victims at this point in 2022. What's particularly interesting about this group is recently, as they went to Lockbit 3, also called Lockbit Black, they released a whole bunch of information about their operations. Nothing that really violates OPSEC, but it does give some pretty critical insight into how they think of themselves. One of the things that they mentioned was that they claim to be from the Netherlands. This was very interesting because most of us think of ransomware operating out of Eastern Europe and Russia, sometimes from China, but realistically, Eastern Europe and Russia. They said, okay, well, we are from the Netherlands. Further along in their frequently asked questions, they say, well, actually, most of us were born in former Soviet countries, but we now operate out of the Netherlands. So some of that's probably some misdirection. But what I think what's not misdirection is the fact that they claim to be apolitical. So they basically say, hey, we're a business. We're only interested in making money. We're not tied to any politics. They came out very early on in the Ukraine-Russia conflict and said, hey, we don't support either Ukraine or Russia. A lot of our people have come from that area, and so we're staying out of the politics of it, and we're just here to make money. One of the other things that was really interesting about some of the information they had on their most recent site was their thorough vetting process for affiliates. And so they go through this very thorough process, and they outline exactly how they do it in terms of making sure you have active Bitcoin wallets. They want screenshots from different affiliates panels to show our different ransomware groups panels to show that you've been an affiliate before, really going through this very thorough process to vet who they're allowing to be an affiliate in their program. As I mentioned before, they claim to be from mostly former Soviet countries, and so they actually prohibit explicitly in their affiliate rules attacking any previous Soviet countries. And one thing that's super interesting that Tony mentioned earlier was the critical infrastructure aspect. Almost all groups before Lockbit, as they looked at version 3.0, said no critical infrastructure at all. We don't want to have another Keystone pipeline in our hands where they're targeting, the FBI is targeting you and stealing back money and things of that nature. They don't want the heat. So Lockbit changed their methodology a little bit. And they said, okay, we prohibit encrypting anything to do with critical infrastructure. But if you want to steal data from critical infrastructure, that's okay. They also said, basically, hey, we're not going to allow people to target and encrypt anything that is going to cause loss of human life. But if you want to steal data from them and use that for extortion, you can do that. So they've really drawn this hard and fast line that we haven't seen before in terms of the targeting methodology and what's acceptable to say, hey, you can still steal data, you can still extort them, you can still target them, but the encryption piece is really the no-no. And so that was pretty interesting in terms of how they're going to go about that. It's pretty innovative in terms of what we've seen in the last couple of years with respect to ransomware. So Lockbit, being a ransomware as a service, they're kind of all over the place in terms of how they're getting into organizations. But open RDP, phishing, credential-related attacks, and vulnerabilities are all going to be pretty key in them getting into the various environments that they're targeting. They also focus really heavily on data exfiltration, as we kind of already mentioned. They use tools like Megacity, they use tools like Overblood. They use legitimate tools to actually do this exfiltration from the environment, which is, as you'll see, not really anything new, and it's used by a lot of groups, but it just shows you that they're using whatever tools are available to get the job done. It's not about having the super cool, complex tools in all cases.
And just on that one right there, so the web security bug bounty, these guys are so sophisticated at this point, like you saw what their panel looks like, they have everything ready to go. So they also opened up a bug bounty. There's not even a whole lot of companies that I know of that have a bug bounty for anything that they have for their software, right? But these guys are actively trying to get better as well. So really taking that mentality, this is a business for them, and they're trying to get better no matter what it is.
Yeah, so another group that operates as part of a ransomware as a service model, and it's a pretty new group in 2022, is Alpha, also known as Black Cat. One of the things that's really unique about them is that they were kind of the first mainstream ransomware variant to be written in Rust. So that makes people like me, my job a lot harder to deal with things like Rust. But basically very similar types of characteristics as we're seeing in Lockbit. This is one of Lockbit's main competitors, and so they actually have a lot of word wars, I guess, and a lot of the different forums that exist on the dark web, which is kind of funny because they always kind of talk shit back and forth to each other. But in a lot of cases, very similar in terms of even TTPs. So RDP, phishing, stolen credentials, vulnerability exploitation, very consistent across the ransomware groups that we're seeing be very effective. Again, data exfiltration is huge for them to pursue that double extortion methodology using tools like Megacity or other open file sharing sites, or again, Rclone, things like that. But one thing that was interesting about Alpha that Lockbit hadn't done until recently was they started threatening DDoS if organizations weren't going to engage them for negotiations. So they basically come to the table and say, hey, you're not going to pay us our ransom. We're going to kind of do this triple extortion deal where we're just going to say we're going to DDoS you for an extended period of time to really put that pressure on and force you to pay us. Their affiliate programs percentage structure is a little bit different as well. They adjust their percentages based on how much of the ransom actually is. So if it's down at 1.5 million or anything below that, it's going to be 80%. Whereas if you have a ransom that's going to be over $3 million, you're going to get 90% of that. So they adjust their stuff on the scale to try to remain competitive within the ransomware landscape. And lastly, just looking at kind of one more group here. This one is a little bit different because they really operate kind of without rules. And this is Vice Society. They really allow targeting of anything. They don't say no or yes to anything. It's just whatever you want to do, go ahead and target that. And they do tend to focus on targets that are a little bit smaller or medium-sized in nature, but they will really target healthcare, they'll target education, they'll target critical infrastructure. They're kind of all over the place in terms of how they're going to do the targeting. Now they, from TTP's perspective, do rely heavily on native binaries on systems so they can try to evade detection. They really focus on backup deletion, and that's one of their hallmarks is they really focus on that. And they're one of the best at weaponizing some of the vulnerabilities that Tony mentioned before very quickly. So a lot of these POCs are coming out, and we're seeing by society turn those around really quickly to actually get those weaponized to get into environments. They're very heavily leveraging proxy chains and other proxy services to remain as anonymous as possible, whereas we see Lockbit, Alpha, and a couple others that are not necessarily as concerned with that part of it. And again, they focus on the data exfiltration. So they've been around for a little over a year now. They're one of the groups that actually doesn't operate as a ransomware as a service. At least they haven't so far. But another one of those groups, just another example of how this one, when you look at their site, it's very plain. Anybody can spin this up very quickly, but they're putting a lot of effort into their operations, and so it kind of shows you the spectrum of what you're seeing with a group like Lockbit, which has a lot of affiliates and a lot of time to be able to develop robust solutions, versus a standalone group, which is going to be obviously responsible for their own operations in addition to the development and maintenance on their websites.
Right, so with this one in particular, right, you can see vulnerabilities are being turned around very quickly and weaponized as always. Some of them are older, from 2019, or some of them even before that, but across all of these various different platforms, right, I mean, it's incredible the amount of the sophistication and thinking outside the box of how to get into environments, right? So like one very good example of this was there was an F5 vulnerability that came out, I think it was in December. We saw it get turned around in less than 2 days and then actually de-utilized, but we didn't actually see it until 6 months later when we got called in to be able to do an incident with those guys. They did a threat hunt across everything, their entire environment. They could not find one single thing that was actually wrong in their environment for as far as persistence goes. But if something just kept getting inside their environment, they kept finding like little dumb things inside their environment, running like PowerShell, trying to get things out of the environment, things of that nature. So when we got in, we actually found out they've been on that F5 device since December, right? Since like 2 days after the POC was actually released, and they've been using it since. So it's just very important, regardless, to make sure that one, you're trying to patch as soon as possible, but two, that you're understanding exactly what that software is that's running on these devices to make sure that you're actually protected.
And I think one of the other things to look at here, and hopefully you can see, okay, but we see a lot of 2019s, 2020s. Those are all contributing to a lot of these breaches that, that Tony and I are very familiar with. And also just looking at the list of platforms on the side there, that's a lot of technologies to make sure that you're keeping up with on a regular basis, right? And the list is certainly even larger than we've had a chance to kind of put on this one slide. So it does actually show kind of the importance of threat intelligence and how to make sure that all that threat intelligence is also being incorporated into your vulnerability management programs, so you can prioritize for your environment based on the platforms and applications you have to make sure you're patching so that you don't end up as one of these victims and end up getting exploited by ransomware.
But one of the big things on this one, just like a show of hands for this one, even going through all these platforms, how many people know like the software building materials, like the SBOM that you have? Does anybody actually have a good one for their entire environment that they know, like this Log4j is on this across my entire environment? No. And that's the problem, right? And when these things start to pop out, these vulnerabilities are not always just for these specific things. They can go across all of them, like Log4j was and other things. So it's getting to know what's actually in your environment and not just what's on one particular platform as well. Right.
Yeah, so taking a look at, and we've already obviously looked at what does 2022 look like right now, but obviously this is a problem now, but it's going to be a problem in the future too. So really, what are the key takeaways here, and where are things going in the future? Well, the first thing is ransomware groups are going to continue to blend on this game, and this is going to rely heavily on the rebranding process. This is going to allow them to continue to split up into seemingly smaller groups. They're going to maybe take certain developers from one group, certain developers from another group. They're going to form other groups, and we're going to see this kind of spiderwebbing happen with these ransomware groups. And so, when we're talking about leaks, we're talking about rebrands, all of this is going to mean that it's going to get harder and harder from a threat intelligence perspective, and really from a defensive perspective, to maintain a good hold on what these groups are doing. So, from that perspective, that just means we need to get more creative. It also means that we need to cooperate more with threat intelligence, have more conversations, be willing to share information so that we can stay on top of things. My personal belief is, let's break down the silos between vendor A, vendor B, and vendor C, and let's all start sharing information more readily so that we can try to keep up. Because if we don't, we're going to get into a position where we are not able to keep up at all, where it's going to be more and more reactive as these groups get better and better at dissolving and reappearing as different groups, or at least seemingly different groups. So that's going to be kind of one of the trends that I think we're going to continue to see, and my team has been saying that for a very long time, that this is going to continue to be a trend until we figure out better ways of staying on top of it.
You also use buzzwords like zero trust.
Zero trust, and all those, exactly, buzzwords.
All right, so there are upsides and there are downsides to all portions of this, right? Like everything we've said so far is like basically just doom and gloom, right? Like ransomware is going to continue to happen, it's going to continue to hit you, you're going to get better, and we're just not doing a great job on it. We are doing a little bit better, I would say, as far as like making sure like groups like Drew's grid team, working with 7-1, working with CrowdStrike, working with Mandy, and having some of these groups that are coming together and actually sharing intelligence, right? And getting it faster than you guys. I would say what I like to believe is some of the slowdowns that we had through this is people actually getting better at it, right? Like getting a little bit more proactive, people doing tabletops, people doing purple teams, seeing how things are actually happening, and getting more engaged in how is this going to happen in my environment, and how can I be more proactive about it. So making sure that you even have an incident response plan, making sure that those things are being utilized properly, right? And everybody knows their roles and responsibilities. So in the case that it does happen, you can mitigate it much faster and contain it in your environment rather than having to pay for it.
And even just having that knowledge of asset applications, I think that Tony already mentioned. It's also I mentioned communication between different vendors and different intel groups and all that, but it's also the communication within your own organizations, making sure that threat intel is talking to SOC and that they're talking to vulnerability management, vulnerabilities talking to SOC, and all these teams are talking. There's a lot of teams, there are a lot of organizations that have a lot of those silos, and that ultimately prevents you from being as effective as possible. So communication really is going to be huge, and that's going to help with everything that's Tony already mentioned.
Right, so what happens if you guys do get hit with ransomware? Because eventually it's probably going to happen to some portion of your network. Hopefully not all of it. But obviously make sure that you have some sort of plan in place, right? But if you have an incident response team, make sure that they're ready for this particular thing. A lot of times it's easier to have a retainer just because these guys are people that are doing incidents every day, might have a little bit more of that muscle memory than somebody who has just been looking at this data day in and day out. That's your SOC or your IR team. They just might not have dealt with an incident as well as somebody who's doing it on a daily basis. Make sure that you understand the situation. This goes back to Drew's point about make sure you understand the assets in your environment. I can't tell you how many times we come into an environment and we say what's the scope like? What has been actually impacted? They have no idea. Okay, well, how many assets do you actually have in your entire network? I have no idea. Right? What's important in your environment? What is the priority system? I have no idea. But I know that this application is what I do. What supports that? I have no idea. So making sure that you understand your environment is crucial in being able to do anything if you're behaving with ransomware. We'll try to figure it out. Obviously, preserving evidence, trying to make sure that you're not just unplugging the entire internet off of everything and turning everything off and wiping everything out. A lot of times you can just be erasing the evidence that could be that root cause that we're going to be looking for. Then obviously try to work with federal law enforcement. Hopefully if you have an IR plan or if you're working with an IR retainer, they have those relationships already to be able to set up so that everybody can deal with, or that information can get over to the FBI, IC3 or whatever needs to happen so everybody gets that intelligence. So some considerations when you're dealing with cyber insurance. Cyber insurance is a weird thing, right? It's still like the wild, wild west out there, to be honest with you. Depending on the policy, maybe things are covered, maybe they're not. But all too often, people put a lot of trust in their cyber insurance policy when they don't really understand it, or they don't have legal counsel or somebody else helping them out through it. Most of the time, when we come into at the end of a an incident, right? We're going to try to get paid for all portions of these. Insurers won't even cover like half of what actually is going to happen, whether that's restoration, whether that's trying to pay for people that have to do overtime, things of that nature to get back up and operational, getting systems back on, maybe even paying. There's a lot of bills that come associated with this, and sometimes your cyber insurance policy just is not good enough to be able to handle all of those. But also cyber insurance is getting harder and harder to get. I mean, they don't come in. They used to just have like this one little spreadsheet you had to fill out to make sure that you had everything you knew. It was never validated. Now they're coming in and making sure that you have EDR in place, that you have firewalls in place, that there are metrics behind all these, that you tested your IR plan, that you have some sort of attestation that you've done a tabletop, things of that nature. They're getting a lot more granular. And we just got done dealing with, I guess, a consortium of insurance, and they're trying to make it even harder, right? Doing scans, making sure that they're doing a pen test on your network before they'll allow you to be part of this, right? Make sure you don't have RDP opening the internet, things of that nature, but also getting a little bit more granular in what they're looking for.
And I think one of the other things too, as far as consideration goes, is don't let cyber insurance be your risk mitigation strategy. Have it be part of it, certainly consider that and whether it's right for your environment, but don't simply just say, we have cyber insurance, we're good to go. If we get hit, we'll just figure it out after that because we have cyber insurance. Take it a step further and say it's part of the strategy, but make sure you're actually going through, you're doing all the people process technology things, add some buzzwords in there, zero trust, whatever, and go from there. But yeah, it's just one of those things that there's a lot of organizations, especially in the past, before when it was even more Wild West, where a lot of organizations would just say, well, we have cyber insurance, so we're good to go. Obviously, that rarely can be the case.
All right, so conclusions, like at the end of this day, what we actually learned from this, ransomware is always going to be a problem. Financial services, we believe, is definitely one where they're going to try to attack probably the most, because that's just where they get the most amount of money out of it, and that's what I would do. And even though they're being harder and harder to track because they're rebranding, they're getting new infrastructure, they're trying to get new Bitcoin wallets to make sure that it's harder and harder to track, we are doing a better job as a community for InfoSec, and we are doing a little bit better to make sure that we're capturing all of that and sharing it through threat intelligence. Can't understate the importance of falling back to the basics. I mean, cybersecurity is hard enough to begin with if you don't start with the easy portions, right? Like making sure that you have asset inventory, making sure you understand what's in your environment, and then starting to build those protections based off of what you know there. And obviously it helps leverage the threat intelligence as you're going through all of those things. Threat intelligence has become this thing where it's more of a buzzword that people get kind of scared about, rather than just understanding that it's just trying to understand what threats are out there, what I have, and where that's actually going to be in the middle.
And with that, appreciate your time today. I'm glad you stopped by, and we're happy to take your questions.
So as of a couple of years ago, we received a big uptick in state-sponsored attacks. There was one that was detected in China and Russia. I was wondering if you noticed any trends as far as state-sponsored.
State-sponsored like ransomware, things of that nature. So one of our beliefs, we talk about this quite often in some of our working groups, is we think that there are a lot of state-sponsored attacks that are being mimicked or like basically shadowed by ransomware attacks. So you'll see a lot of those source code things that are just released out. We think that a lot of those attacks that are very specifically trying to get into organizations, or most of the time espionage things of that nature, are being covered up by those things. So some definitely, but an uprise in it, I think, like especially with state-sponsored stuff, it's so low and slow that they're trying to figure out exactly what they are. It's hard to say that there's a huge uptick in it.
One other thing that we have seen just in the community overall is there's some people who are definitely state-sponsored. They are on the sanctions list, so you can't pay them. They're actually going and buying off-the-shelf ransomware, or they're becoming affiliates for off-the-shelf ransomware groups, and they're deploying that. So that's a way of kind of subverting all the sanctions piece and being tied back to people. So that's certainly a tactic that might be in play a lot of places too.
Yeah, you had shown there that not only are the businesses adopting cyber insurance, but you also said that ransomware operators are having insurance as well. Who's providing insurance?
Oh, no. They don't, they're not getting insurance. They're making sure that they're attacking the insurance carriers to get the information out of them. So now I know who to attack afterwards. I'm sorry for the confusion. Anybody else?
Are the advanced payments always encrypted?
The ransomware payments always encrypted. I wouldn't say.
Encrypted.
Oh, in crypto? Yeah. For the most part, yeah, I don't think I've ever, yeah. Now, the currency might be different, like whether it's Monero or whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's, I think one was like fiat or something ridiculous. But yeah, for the most part. We actually just had our lowest ransomware payment. Yeah, it was $2,000 or something. I've never seen one that low before, but that was a real weird currency as well.
I was actually like the initial demand was 2,000. Now we talked them down that much. They just came over like that. Way in the back.
So on cloud native services like RDS and things like that, AWS, how do you protect against ransomware on those? Or is it basically, I tend to say it's not foolproof, right? Because it's not running on IaaS, you can't go and encrypt the underlying operating system. Are those typically attacked, and how would you protect them?
So a lot of people will actually try to go to the cloud for various different things of that nature because it's just risk mitigation. I don't own it. Somebody else has to be able to make sure that it's backed up and everything of that nature. So for the most part, unless it's like something that you're running like IaaS or below, right? You don't really have to worry about it too much. You can leave it on down. Now that opens up a whole other ball of worms because a lot of times it's not being encrypted anymore. It's just the exfiltration portion of it. So they might be the whole way through all your SaaS-based applications because they got credentials for whatever they're being stored that way. And then you have to go back and be able to say like, hey, we have my agreement with whatever third party it is. Can you tell me what happened here? And do you have that in your agreements or not? So that is a tough one. We have been dealing with that recently.
We are also seeing that kind of being used as an entry point into further parts of the environment as well, or gathering additional information that can be used to get to the environment. So although we haven't seen it used for some sort of big encryption event yet, there's always that possibility in the future.
Right. And that includes even like 365 compromises, things of that nature.
Right.
It's the same concept.
Just curious, in your experience, companies pay around that make them a much bigger target in the future?
Well, most of the time, no. We have seen people get re-encrypted a couple of times, but that was mainly, I would call it their fault, right? There was still like some persistence that was in the environment that allowed it to happen again. But for the most part, I mean, this is a business for them. So like, if they can't be behind their word, like how this thing happened, even a lot of times, like if we're in negotiations with them and we're going to pay, they'll give you the entire like playbook of what they did. You got in on this date, you do this, and this. So they'll tell you like, you should already have this patched, or these things, or maybe they already patched it for you, something of that nature. But even when you do pay, let's just say it's like for the exfiltration portion, they'll remove it from every forum that they have. Like they're actually pretty decent about trying to make sure that they remove everything from there and from their payment site.
I think, one of the things that Conti, Claire most recently gave us insight into is that they actually didn't delete the data. They took it off of their leak site. They didn't actually delete it from their servers, and so they kept the data. So it kind of shows you that they kind of meet you in the middle and they take things down from public sources, but they don't necessarily delete it. So it's kind of like their rainy day fund.
Yeah, it still is a criminal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the other day, you're killing them. They do really believe in reputation, and so a lot of clients have asked us, well, what if our decryptor doesn't work? What if they still don't take our data down? I think in my experience anecdotally, I have never seen a decryptor not work, at least in the last 2 years after ransomware groups really got figured out. And I've never seen a ransomware group not take the data off of the leak site once they've been paid. And it all kind of comes back to reputation.
And even if there is issues, get on their chat site and work back and forth to make sure that it will work.
And I work with customers. Yep, they really do.
Okay.
Do you guys advise clients to pay the ransom or not?
So we don't say you shouldn't, but we also don't say that you should, right? At the end of the day, it's a business decision. It's a risk that you have to be able to set. A lot of times when you do have to pay, I mean, think about it like, like kidnapping, because essentially that's what this is. Like, this is your business that's just being taken away, right? It's going to die because of it, right? Like, I'm never going to have it again because my business would shutter if I couldn't get this data back. Then sometimes you do have to pay, right? Or if you have to save so much space because of the exfiltration things that are out there, sometimes you just have to. So we try very hard not to make it one of those things that's ostracized around everything. We just say sometimes you have to make those decisions.
That's a big reason why legal counsel is involved in almost all of these. I think we have time for one more question. If there's one more question up there, otherwise, thanks for stopping by. Last minute.
How often are unwitting third-party bulk mailers involved in the delivery?
I would say phishing is still probably the number one way that organizations are being compromised, and that usually starts with any of the various key crime groups, QuackBot, ICE-IP, Emotech, Dridex.
There's always been a man delivering an email like Securit or Google.
All it's all over the place.
Have we ever kind of hold them to a standard to?
There's some regulations. There's some interesting regulations that are coming through to see like how to be able to stop that from things being moved through the internet, right? So while I don't think they ever will be, to be honest, because I just putting those kind of regulations down, I don't think that any Congress or any lawmaking body is technical enough to be able to say these are what the things you have to do to make sure things happen. But I do think that there will be some sort of regulations that come out that are very costly.
In the end, I don't care about Evil Court or Rebel, it's Securit, that's my number one threat.
Right, well, and then it can go, that rabbit hole goes down, right? Well, your ISP allowed this data to go from over here to over there. It's like, well, I allow a lot of traffic to go. So